Hey everyone, thanks. So yeah, I'm Steve Lee, and this talk is called Creative Process for Level Designers. First, a little bit about myself. I've been making levels for quite a while now. I started off making them for Doom and Quake when I was a kid, and I moved on to Half-Life 2 when that came out, and that was like a really formative game for me. It kind of says a lot about what I love about level design. And since then, I got into the industry with a Half-Life 2 level as my main portfolio piece. And I worked in AAA for about 10 years, primarily as a level designer. I started off in a game called Wheelman back in England, and then I moved here to Poland to work on Bulletstorm, Hope People Can Fly, and then Bioshock Infinite over in the US, and most recently Dishonored 2 at Arcane Studios in France. Moved around a lot. I did a talk at GDC 2017 called An Approach to Holistic Level Design. And this talk is kind of meant as a complement to it in some ways. So if you're interested, feel free to go look it up on YouTube. After doing that talk, I've been freelance in London for about a year in England, and I've done a couple of visits to universities and talked to a lot of students. And something what students were often asking about was process and how to approach level design and process in general. So I thought it'd be good to do a talk about it, and that's what this is. Before I get stuck in, there's a few disclaimers. The first thing is that this talk is kind of primarily aimed at those students and kind of newer level designers in general, rather than being like a super advanced thing. So if you've shipped games before and you've done this for a while, then some of this might not be very new, but I hope that's okay and it's still interesting to you. The second thing is that in some ways it's kind of hard to get specific about process because it can be so different for different games and different teams. So this talk focuses more on very general principles rather than trying to offer any kind of step-by-step guide on how to make a map or anything like that. And finally, while I hope these principles are very universal and genre agnostic in some ways, at the end of the day, I'm still very biased towards certain kinds of games that I like and the kind of games that I've worked on. So this generally means single-player games. I like games that combine gameplay and narrative. Usually in specific and handcrafted spaces and not like huge open worlds and stuff. But again, I hope there's something in here for everyone. Okay, so now that I've done everything I can to lower your expectations, we can get stuck in. This talk is split into 4 topics. The first is about the blank canvas and how to get past it. The second one is about working iteratively and what this means. The third one is a few tips for playtesting. And finally, a little ramble about what it means to design elegantly and why I think this is important. Okay, so the first section, the so-called blank canvas. When I was talking to students, and I took a few questions from people on Twitter now and again, a question that came up, or like a request for tips and advice, people were often asking me about how to get past the blank canvas, and what do you do when you first open up a map? And I thought about this in relation to my own experience in the industry, and also back when I was working for maps for over games as a modder, like Half-Life 2 and stuff. And my personal take on this is that I don't think a level designer's canvas is ever really blank, because you're always designing in a context, right? You always have specific goals that you're trying to achieve, and you never just have total freedom to just do whatever you want. Here's a quote from a book called 101 Things I Learned at Architecture School, which I like to bang on about a lot, and it sums this up very eloquently, I think. Louis Sullivan is a very celebrated architect from over 100 years ago, I think. He's quoted as saying, "A proper building grows naturally, logically, and poetically out of its conditions." And along similar lines, Jonathan Ives, the lead industrial designer at Apple, had this to say about designing Apple products. He says that when forms develop with reason, and they're not just arbitrary shapes, it feels almost inevitable, almost undesigned. It feels almost like, well, of course it's that way. Why would it be any other way? And what both of these quotes are getting at is that your canvas as a designer is always shaped by your goals and your constraints. And it's your job at the start of the process to make sure you really understand what these are. Typical examples of goals and constraints in game development for level designers are things like you might have been assigned to work on the 3rd level of the game, and this game is of a certain genre, and you might need to introduce this mechanic or convey this story beat or idea. And you probably have a certain amount of art support and a location that you have to set the level. And all of these things, all of this information helps you focus on solutions that specifically address these goals and constraints. And you can also be thinking about how your level should complement the rest of the levels in the game. In which ways should your level be similar to all the others for the sake of consistency and cohesion? And in which ways should it stand apart from the other levels in the game and be unique? So hopefully, if you think about things in this very logical way, it becomes less about all of the millions of things that a level could be, with you struggling to decide which direction to go in, and it becomes more about what a level should be and what it needs to be in order to be considered a success and make you feel like you did a good job. So as a little example of this kind of logical approach at the start, I'm going to talk a bit about the Dust District, which was the mission I worked on in Dishonored 2, and some of the thought process behind the very general layout in its early stages. When I arrived at Arcane, I was assigned to this mission, which really only existed in design documents at that point, as an idea, essentially, and a premise, with some constraints laid out. And the first few weeks were all about talking to my two leads, Christophe Carrier and Joachim Davio, about what the mission needed to be. And a lot of things came up in these discussions. There were lots of different kinds of constraints. But the main three things that came up were these things. The main thing was that the premise of the mission is all about there being two factions and two targets, which is quite distinctive for a Dishonored mission because there's typically only one. And the player can choose between these factions and help one in order to progress to the next level. The second big kind of unique constraint of this mission was that the exit to the mission is the Jindosh lock, which is this weird contraption used to secure a building that you're trying to gain access to. And you can unlock this weird contraption by either helping one of the factions and acquiring the solution from them, or you can solve a very hard puzzle to just get through there yourself without even talking to the factions and essentially skipping a lot of the mission, which is a big deal. And the third kind of constraint that was established at that time was that Megan, who's one of the friendly characters in the game, she is in the mission and she's there to talk to you and give you some important information about how the mission works. And like I say, there were lots of other constraints too, but these were the main ones that contributed to the very high level structure of the level. So yeah, after thinking through the level design implications of those three constraints, I remember drawing a diagram that looks a bit like this one, and those constraints naturally led to this kind of structure when you think about what those constraints mean. It shows the players start at the bottom, and next, the first thing that the player encounters structurally is Megan. And then the next thing is the Jindosh lock, and then after that there is a choice between two factions and a connection between the two in a kind of loop. And so yeah, the first thing is that, why is Megan at the start of this mission? What dictates that she has to be there and not at in a different part of the mission, in the map? And the first question when it comes to figuring out the real meaning of Megan being in this mission is, if she's there to give information, the first question to ask is whether that information is critical information for the player. Do they need to know this, and do they need to talk to Megan in order to understand how this mission works? Because if she's critical, then we need to force the player to meet this character, as opposed to her being an optional thing hidden away in the map that some players might encounter. Yeah, it was established very early on that because there's a lot of kind of weird stuff in this mission, kind of unique things for us to explain, the information that Megan gives would definitely be critical, and we should kind of take this opportunity to talk to the player, essentially, and explain things. And so it was a given then that Megan needed to be at the start of the mission, because it's much easier to force the player to meet someone near the start of a mission, especially in a very non-linear game like Dishonored. It's easier to do that at the start of a mission than at the end. So that was a given by that point. The other big thing is the Jindosh lock, which, as I mentioned, is the exit to the level. And in a linear game, maybe that would mean that the natural place for the exit to the level is at the end of the level, right? But then, in this case, because this Jindosh lock presents an important choice to the player, it changed things. It couldn't be just at the end of the level, because we want the player to encounter the door before they can have a solution for it, essentially. It's kind of this kind of a common level design principle that you want to show the player the obstacle first, and then allow them to decide how they're going to deal with this obstacle or get around this problem on their own. And so in that sense, we couldn't have the player encounter the factions and potentially acquire the solution to this lock before they reach the lock, because that would be kind of lame. You turn up to the obstacle and you've already got the answer to it. And like I say, we also want to present this important choice of the player choosing not to work with the factions at all and just solve it on their own. And so, yeah, all of these things point to the Jindosh lock having to be presented to the player before the factions and not at the end of the map, which, you know, like I say, if it was a linear game, might be the natural thing to do. And here's a screenshot from the final game of a map that you can find in the mission. And as you can see, apart from it being rotated 90 degrees, the high-level layout and structure of the map didn't change, because, you know, the solution was derived from the constraints that I was given, and those constraints didn't change, so the solution didn't change. And you know, that's all. Of course, that's a bit of a simplification, because, you know, like I said, there was a lot of other constraints we were considering too. And on a more kind of low level, all kinds of things changed, right? But the high-level stuff didn't. And you know, we kind of saved some headache, I suppose, by making sure that the solution was logical. And that's the overall point of this section, is that I think at the very start of the creative process, and throughout the process really, the creative process has to be approached logically, where solutions are derived from a proper understanding of your goals and your constraints. And if you ever feel stuck on what feels like a blank canvas at the start of the map, then it might be that you need to think more about specifically what your goals and constraints really are, because they usually point you in certain directions. I should take a sip of water. So yeah, with that very high-level sense of the structure of the level in place, the next thing is to start figuring out some of the more nitty-gritty stuff, which brings us to this idea of working iteratively and what this means. I think it's fair to say that all levels and all games have to be made iteratively. Like, there's no question. It's not. I don't think it's a debate, because, and this means like a design has to be approached as an exploration, with you kind of finding solutions and details along the way. You know, it's the opposite of, you know, writing a huge design document with extensive descriptions of all the scenes and like drawing out every little detailed architectural layout. And thinking that you've done the design then, and the rest of the time is just spent making it, because it never works out like that. Like it's just not how game design works. It's too complicated, essentially. To quote a couple of famous writers on this kind of thing, Ernest Hemingway famously said that the first draft of anything is shit, basically. And along similar lines, Stephen King has described writing as rewriting. And what they're saying here is that quality can only come from iteration. And so I think an important skill to develop as a designer is learning to work quick and dirty, I like to say. And this is why level designers spend a lot of their time blocking things out in big boxes that don't look great, but they perform the function that is required. Because we need to be able to make things quickly and change things quickly and test things early, and generally iterate as many times as possible in order to reach the best design and best solution that we can. And while you're doing this, all this iterating and figuring stuff out, I think there are basically two modes to work in. There's working vertically and working horizontally. Vertically, you know, this is all about quality, and working vertically is like the best example is if you've worked in AAA, especially. There's always a vertical slice at the start of development, which is where the whole team takes a thin slice of the game, maybe like 1 or 2 levels, and the whole team is focused on basically hitting quality and executing those 2 levels to a very high level of quality to learn about what it takes to, well, whether the ideas are good, frankly, and like what it takes to achieve quality and how long it takes and all that kind of stuff. And all the components that are required to achieve high quality. And that's what vertical development is about. It's about figuring out quality. By contrast, working horizontally is about the bigger picture and how everything fits together. And this involves a lot of like creating placeholder content a lot of the time, and very simple versions of things, maybe across, to cover every main part of a level, for example, in order to be able to play the whole thing from start to finish and focus on like the composition of things and structure and pacing and those kind of questions. And a key thing to remember is to alternate between these two modes throughout the process to keep an eye on both kind of axes of development, right? You need to be, of course, you need to be thinking about quality and crunching through that and figuring out, what it takes and solving those hard problems. But you also need to be take a step back now and again and think about how everything fits together in terms of the bigger picture. And one of the eternal struggles I find with level design and working quick and dirty and all this iteration is that the iteration gets increasingly difficult as you get further into the process, because eventually your clunky level designer boxes need to be changed into like beautiful looking art from an artist. This is a screenshot from, or a couple of screenshots from a DLC map that I made for Bulletstorm back at People Can Fly, and on the top is what my kind of dirty level designer blockout looked like after lots of iteration. Before it was then handed to an artist to make it look awesome. And the thing is that before it's handed off to an artist, before everything looks awesome and then it's full of meshes and it's really heavy and complicated, you need to have already iterated before that point, because once it does look like that, then change becomes extremely complicated and painful, and it creates arguments and it forces other people to redo their work and all that kind of stuff. And I think this is like, I say it's an eternal struggle because I think where it comes from is that the artist's creative process is different to the level designers. I think when the artist is trying to iterate on their work and increase the visual fidelity, it's important for them to lock down the layout earlier in the process than it is for than level designers like to. Because for level designers, the iteration is sometimes changing the layout. And so that's where this fundamental tension comes from, where the artist just doesn't want things to change so that they can polish things, and the level designer sometimes needs things to change for it to satisfy gameplay requirements. And according to as your understanding of what the level should be is kind of becoming clearer and clearer over the process. So yeah, this section is about working iteratively, and as a summary of the main points. The first one is that quality can only come from iteration, and we shouldn't assume that our first version of anything is going to work very well. The second thing is the importance of alternating between what I've called vertical and horizontal iteration to keep your eye on every aspect of the level, essentially, both in terms of quality and composition and structure and those kind of things, how everything fits together. And the third thing is just to try and think ahead and be considerate and do everything you can to minimize headaches between level design and art, which is really hard. Like I've had them on every project I've worked on, frankly. And it's a fundamental tension in the process that we've all got to be mindful of, essentially. Okay, the third bit of this talk is a fairly quick one, I think, with a few tips on playtesting. The first thing about playtesting is that I think it's very easy to do too little of it and too late. It's really important to see playtesting as a fundamental part of the iteration process I was talking about, and not something that you do after all the iteration has taken place. And I think on both a company scale and for us as individual level designers, it's always tempting to kind of hold off on playtesting until you've kind of done a little bit more to make it representative, and you polish things a bit more and everything's feeling nice and in place. But the thing is that it's kind of risky, because the whole point of playtesting is to learn what you need to change. And if you wait until everything's nice and polished, then you're not going to want to change things, because you've attached to it and you've spent a lot of time doing things. And yeah, changes are now just expensive and complicated. And so you're kind of undermining the whole point of playtesting if you leave it too late, because you're not able to be as agile and responsive to the feedback you get and what you learn. And yeah, learning is what the playtesting is all about. It's the only way to really learn what your level is, because it doesn't matter what it's like when you play it at your computer, or even how it comes across to your lead in a level design review. The main thing is that when players who are completely fresh to the game play it, what happens and how do they feel about it, right? And over time, I've come to think that a lot of the information you get from playtesting boils down to focus and clarity. I think every level designer who's shipped a game has had their kind of first nightmare playtest session where they think, you think you've made something really cool, and all of a sudden when you've tested it a bit and it all plays out like you want, but then you get a bunch of external playtesters in, and it's just a mess, and they don't do anything that you want them to do. They don't see the things that you were hoping they would look at. They don't understand the story or any of this stuff. And it's when you learn that there's a massive gap between your perspective on a level as the designer of it, who knows everything about it, and somebody who's completely new to the game and doesn't know what this level is, doesn't even know what the game is, and is learning everything from scratch. And so much of what we do is not just about making something cool, but communicating this stuff to players and helping them understand things and focusing their thoughts and attention on the things that are important. And I think it's very common for less experienced designers to make things that are too hard, too complicated, too lacking in focus and direction and clarity for players to have the intended experience. And so, yeah, clarity is a big part of design and not something to be kind of underestimated. A second kind of tip for learning the most you can from playtesting is being open to everything, like all issues and feedback that you hear, and taking responsibility for addressing them. Not necessarily literally every criticism you hear, but every trend that comes up, every bit of repeated feedback that you get is probably a real issue. And this also involves like never blaming players for like not understanding things or not paying attention to the things you want them to. Because if they struggle with stuff and even things that you think are really obvious or easy, then it's on you as a level designer to fix it. And it's just not the right approach to think that players are dumb and you've got to dumb things down or like that it's their fault in any way. And a lot of design is realizing like, oh, this thing is too complicated for a player to understand, or it's not presented in the right sequence or in the right way to allow players to understand it. Another thing is about choosing playtesters thoughtfully and thinking about the kind of biases that different people come with and the preconceptions they bring to the way when they play the game for the first time, or not the first time, which is another thing. Where, like, you've got to be really conscious of like, obviously there's a difference between somebody playtesting it if they're on the team and they know what the game is and they have their own ideas of what the levels are and all this kind of thing. There's a huge difference between someone like that playtesting it, and this includes your lead as well sometimes, and completely fresh playtesters brought in externally. And the thing is that the first time somebody plays something is the most valuable time, and you can't waste these opportunities to get these kind of valuable first impressions of the game from people. And so if you've got a limited number of people that you can get to playtest, try to ration them out and make sure you get the most from every one of them. And the final tip is about helping playtesters be honest and useful, because playtesting can be a really delicate thing in terms of like how easy it is to taint the feedback and kind of like twist the discussion in a way that ends up changing what playtesters tell you about the game. And one example of this was that I was visiting a studio to test a game recently, and there was a group discussion about the playtest session afterwards. And when people started talking, I realized that a lot of the other playtesters in the group were game students and local game students. And this meant that, like, it turned out that a lot of these game students, I suspected, secretly really wanted a job at this company of the game they were playing. And so it made them really hesitant to say anything negative about the game. And they were all just like struggling to come up with like really positive things to say about the game to make a good impression, which is obviously nice, but it's kind of useless as a developer. And you got to do everything you can to help players feel like they can be honest and give you the feedback you need. So a few little tips there is that, like, first of all, you can literally just tell them that you're looking for things that they don't understand, like, and make it clear that that's why they're here. It's not for them to have great fun necessarily. It's about like, you helping them learn what needs to change and evolve about the game. The second thing is that if you're sitting next to a playtester while they play the game, which has pros and cons, but I think it's valuable to do now and again. You could just ask them to vocalize their thoughts as they're playing the game. Like if, just to make them not have a conversation with you, but just say out loud what they're thinking and like why they're doing this and like what confuses them and all those kind of things. Because their thoughts are basically the closest thing to the player experience that you can get. And it's like, that's what the whole point of this is, to figure out how they feel about what's happening and not just what is happening. And the last thing is just about avoiding leading questions that kind of nudge playtesters towards like certain answers. And especially if, I've seen it a lot where you're playtesting with another designer or your lead, and you want to ask a question in a certain way that makes it look like everything's fine, so that your lead doesn't tell you to change something. And obviously that's just not a good thing to do. You've got to find ways to ask questions in as neutral way as possible to get real information from them. And neutral questions can be things like why were you trying to do this, or what were you trying to do here, or like what do you think about this character, rather than like do you think there are any problems with the layout, or like and other things where basically you ask playtesters to make value judgments. Sometimes they can be very shy about expressing their opinion honestly, and yeah, you just got to think about the way you ask questions and how it's going to influence the feedback you get. And I think that's it. Yeah, so that's the last. That's the playtesting section, and gone through this quite quickly. The last section is about designing elegantly, which isn't necessarily a process thing, so much as something that I think we should be aware of at every step of the process. I think it's this really crucial concept in game development and design. And it's something that experienced designers learn to do instinctively, I think, over time, to design elegantly. But we don't really talk about it much, as if it's relative to how important that is. So I wanted to take the opportunity to bang on about it a bit now. I think the simplest way of defining what elegance means to design is with this kind of formula, which is to say that elegance is simplicity multiplied by functionality and what you're getting out of something. So it's about coming up with decisions and ideas that are both simple, but that give you a lot in return. Throughout this talk, I've quoted a bunch of people from other mediums, kind of to draw attention to how some creative principles are fairly universal and not just contained to the particular discipline or medium. And I think of all of these, the concept of elegance is like the most universal one. I think it cuts to the heart of what makes almost anything good. And it's how you can see that people are good at what they do when they can work elegantly and make elegant decisions. I like this quote from Christopher Nolan. He's talked about how he considers all filmmaking to be smart compromise, which to me is really interesting, given that Christopher Nolan seems like, at this stage of his career, a director with infinite creative freedom and infinite Hollywood money. But for him, even then, he feels that he has to approach his process in terms of smart compromise and thinking about what is within the constraints that I have, what is the most elegant thing I can do to kind of, achieve what I'm trying to do. And the thing is, if that's how filmmaking is for Christopher Nolan, I think that's like, it's 10 times that for game development, because game development is just always a bit of a mess. Right? If you've ever shipped a game, it's like the second half of development is always a bit bonkers. Everything takes longer than expected, and there's never enough time to do things the way you'd like to do. Everything's more complicated to do than it was expected. Weird bugs are coming out from all kinds of unexpected places, and players are testing stuff finally, and they don't understand how things work. And some poor level designer has to take their level and split it into 2 sections because it doesn't fit into memory. And that's happened on every game I've worked on. And just everything is always slightly bloated, slightly out of control, slightly on fire. And this will probably always be the case with game development because it's just very complicated. But I think we can all try to help things be slightly less chaotic by just being mindful about elegance at every stage of the process. And for level designers, this means a bunch of things. I think on a daily basis, you can be analyzing your ideas and the way you work in terms of questions like these, like, will this cool idea I have create weird edge cases and scary bugs later on when you try and polish this? And if so, maybe there's a slightly less cool idea that would be way less painful later, which is the better idea because of that. Sometimes elegance is all about that balance between what you're getting out of something and what you're putting in. And another question is like, does this idea solve multiple problems and complement other ideas in the level? And does it fit things and connect to lots of things? Because if it does, then you're getting a lot out of it, and it's half of what elegance is about. Thirdly, is there any way of doing this that doesn't require new art assets or new tech from code, and basically doesn't require adding more work to somebody else's schedule? Are there ways in which the layout and the playable area that I've designed could just be smaller? And could we achieve the same thing with just less work for both you and the level artist on the map? And finally, which of these two ideas that you might be comparing is easier for players to understand? Because if you have two ideas and they're both kind of as cool as each other, but one of them is way simpler, then you should go for that one. And so on. And so there are lots of things you can be considering on a daily basis to focus on elegance and be mindful of it. And to sum it up, I've got 3 tips for it. The first thing is about speed and clarity. And it's basically just always looking for the simplest way to create something interesting and high quality. And this isn't really, it doesn't mean that everything needs to be simple and that you should be minimalist and never ambitious with what you do. It just means being smart about how you choose and execute your ambitious ideas. It's about just making sure that you're not doing things you don't need to do. The second point about elegance is richness and interconnectedness. Whenever you can, just try and find ideas that serve multiple purposes or solve multiple problems and connect with other ideas in a meaningful way. Like I said, the first point was about simplicity. This one is about making sure that you're getting a lot from your ideas, and it's bringing a lot of value to the table. An example that occurred to me with Dishonored in general, but particularly a few narrative scenes in my mission, was these scenes which weren't simple to do at all, to be honest. Some of them were a nightmare, very technically complicated and involved lots of tweaking and bug fixing and stuff. But all that work was justified by the fact that I knew that they were bringing a lot of value to the table, and they were satisfying lots of goals at once. Because in the kind of game that Dishonored is, these kind of what would be normally just narrative scenes where maybe the player watches it through a bit of bulletproof glass or something like that. In Dishonored, the way we do it is everything happens in front of the player, and it's simulated, and it's still interactive. And so inherently, you're getting a lot more out of it. So instead of it just being a narrative scene that conveys fictional stuff, you're also doing things like starting these scenes with dialogue so that the player can hear the dialogue and be aware of the enemies before they can see them, which is really important for a stealth game. In this particular case, with this mission, because it's about choosing which of 2 factions to help, it's important. These kind of narrative scenes are particularly important because I need to inform the player about who these factions are and what they stand for, so that the player has an opinion on these factions and they choose which faction to help with more purpose, essentially. And there's other things like all of these scenes. I tried to put as many of these scenes in to reduce the amount of NPCs who are just generic video game baddies just walking on patrol paths, which games have too many of. And I wanted to, wherever possible, have every character look like they're doing something, and they're in the world before you get there, and they're not just NPCs. And finally, another thing was that I really wanted these scenes to be dynamic situations that where dramatic stuff is happening and the player is encouraged to interact and intervene, even, instead of just narrative scenes where you're kind of hidden away and you just wait for it to finish, and then you do your stealth gameplay stuff. So overall, I was just trying to make sure these scenes just did everything at once, and I could justify the amount of work they took by understanding how much they were bringing to the table. And the final point is about focus and quality, which is about simplifying or cutting things, and embracing simplifying and cutting anything that isn't clear or necessary or cohesive or high quality. I think cutting things tends to be seen as an inherently bad thing, and I think it's because it's often done too late, and it's out of desperation for scheduling reasons rather than cutting things earlier for design reasons. Because cutting things isn't just something you do because you don't have time. It's you can cut things to improve a design and to allow both you as a developer and the players to focus on things that matter the most. And so I think it's good to just take cutting as a part of the process and not like an emergency band-aid at the end of it. So yeah, I think elegance is really important and worth a lot of thought at every stage of the process. I'd go as far as saying that, I think anything in games that is really good and was finished on time, or anywhere close to on time, involved elegant design and decision making. And it's something we should be mindful of whenever we can. And that's it. This talk has been about these 4 things, and I hope it was interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions for Mr. Lee?
I'll be around to chat afterwards if you'd rather chat outside of the room.
Hi, thank you for the talk again. And I want to ask you, how would you compare yourself like right now and as a level designer like 15 years ago when you probably started or something like that? How are you different as a level designer? Like, why do you get the big bucks now and not the money that like someone that started 6 months ago? Yeah.
Do you mean, is the question how do I feel I've changed over time as a designer?
Yeah.
Yeah, like I said, I suppose it's. I think the main thing is to do with the iterative side of things. Like I think, and the elegance thing, like some of what I talked about in the terms of how over time you just learn that which things tend not to work out the way you thought you did. And like I say, those nightmare playtests where it's like, oh, I thought a player would totally look over here and do this, but they didn't do that at all. And you just kind of slowly gradually refine your instincts on like what actually works and the way players think, and the things that you can really underestimate or overestimate when if you don't test things. And then I suppose another side of it is just all the development stuff where you just learn. You go through some bad experiences where like you get into massive arguments with artists or producers or all kinds of stuff because everything's messy and complicated, and you try to just again, just minimize the pain whenever you can. Think ahead and think, oh, we ran into this problem before. Or like, that poor guy had to split his level before, and I don't want to have to do that. So I'm going to try and make my level as small as it can be while still being everything it needs to be. And yeah, you just kind of try to learn from all these scary mistakes, I suppose.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else? Are we done? Like I said, I'll be around to chat in the lobby and stuff if anyone's interested. Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steve Lee.